Welcome you to the new season of World Wave Audio, where we slice through the noise and pull back the curtain on the most complex issues shaping our world.
Your shortcut to really understanding the world's most complex issues. Today, we're diving deep into, well, a convergence of two critical, interconnected global crises. And they're undeniably setting the stage for one of the most anticipated geopolitical moments of 2025. We're talking about the high-stakes summit set for August 15th in Alaska between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, on the surface, it's all about trying to end the protracted war in Ukraine. But here's the thing. This isn't happening in a vacuum, not at all. It's playing out against the deeply troubling backdrop of an escalating and frankly quite punitive trade war between the United States and India. We've assembled a stack of fascinating sources for you today, everything from major news outlets like Al Jazeera, Reuters, PBS NewsHour, and the Times of India, right through to sharp geopolitical analysis from KPMG and a deeper dive from Republic World. Our mission for you, our curious listener, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from these diverse perspectives. We want you to walk away from this deep dive not just informed, but genuinely understanding the complex currents that are shaping our world right now.
Exactly. And this isn't just about catching up on the latest headlines, not really. It's about pulling back the curtain to truly grasp the underlying motivations of these global players.
Yeah.
Understanding the leverage they're trying to exert and recognizing the profound implications these intertwined events will have on global security, economic stability, and the very balance of power. We'll be connecting the dots between the brutal battlefield in Ukraine, the high-stakes negotiations in the Oval Office in the Kremlin, and even the bustling, resilient markets of Delhi. It's a truly intricate web.
It really is. So let's unpack this Alaska summit first. It feels like it came together quite rapidly. What were the critical steps, the diplomatic chess moves that ultimately led to this meeting between President Trump and President Putin?
Right, it does seem quick on the surface. But what's truly fascinating here is the precise and, yes, rather swift timeline that paved the way. The groundwork, though, was laid over several months. The process truly began to accelerate with a pivotal phone call between Trump and Putin back on February 12, 2025. Now, this wasn't just a casual chat. It marked the initiation of a completely new phase of negotiations, moving away from previous, less direct engagements.
Okay.
Following that, we saw a flurry of high-level meetings. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for instance, engaged directly with his Russian counterparts. And notably, President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, made multiple high-impact visits to Moscow. One of those was a critical 3-hour meeting on August 6th, just days before the summit was announced. The U.S. described that one as highly productive, really setting the final groundwork. It was a clear signal both sides were serious about direct engagement.
And it sounds like there was a very deliberate pressure campaign involved, almost an ultimatum. Can you walk us through that? Because that seems key.
Absolutely. That was the decisive factor, the real trigger. President Trump's explicit ultimatum. He set a firm deadline, Friday, August 8th. Russia had to agree to a peace deal by then or face severe new economic penalties. And he specifically mentioned tariffs on nations buying Russian oil. This wasn't just a warning. It was a clear demonstration of economic statecraft as a tool of coercion.
And they followed through.
They did. When that deadline passed without a deal, the White House acted swiftly. Hours later, through Executive Order 14329, they imposed an additional 25% tariff on a wide range of goods imported from India.
On top of existing ones.
Exactly. On top of an existing 25% tariff, bringing the total duty on most Indian products to a truly punitive 50%.
Yeah.
It was only after this significant economic pressure was applied, a clear signal of serious intent, that both sides officially announced the August 15th meeting in Alaska. This sequence fundamentally highlights the coercive nature of the diplomacy at play.
Wow.
Trump was, in essence, trying to force Putin to the table by squeezing one of his key economic partners.
That makes the timeline much clearer. But then, the choice of Alaska, why there? Is it just a convenient halfway point, or is there more symbolism involved?
Well, it's certainly practical as a midway point. Yeah. Simplifies logistics for both delegations. That's true. But its significance runs much deeper than mere geography. Alaska holds a powerful symbolic weight for both nations.
The historical connection.
Precisely. It was, famously, a former Russian territory, sold to the United States back in 1867 for, well, a paltry $7.2 million. Kremlin aide Yuri Yushakov made sure to highlight this historical connection. He explicitly stated that the region is where U.S. and Russian economic interests intersect.
Interesting phrasing.
Very. It wasn't just diplomatic nicety. It hinted at Moscow's desire for a broader strategic and economic reset with the U.S., one that extends far beyond just ending the immediate conflict in Ukraine. For Putin, meeting on former Russian soil might even carry a subtle psychological edge,
And the practical side.
And then there's the pragmatic necessity. Alaska offers a convenient diplomatic bypass around the International Criminal Court arrest warrant currently out for Putin. Meeting in a non-ICC member state like the U.S. avoids any legal complications that would severely limit his travel to many other nations.
Right. Makes sense.
So it's a strategically chosen, symbolically rich, and pragmatically essential venue all at once.
Given all that context, what's truly driving President Trump to push for this summit right now? Is it simply about ending a war, or are there perhaps deeper motivations at play here?
It's definitely more than just ending a conflict, I'd say. A central pillar of the second Trump administration's foreign policy doctrine, as it's manifested in 2025, is the active cultivation of President Trump's image as a global peacemaker.
The president of peace narrative.
Exactly. That narrative, which is heavily emphasized domestically, was significantly bolstered just weeks before the Alaska summit announcement. His administration successfully mediated a trilateral peace accord between Armenia and Azerbaijan in early August 2025.
Ah, yes, the Tri-PP corridor deal.
That's the one. This achievement was not just noted, it was prominently featured by the White House, even leading to the establishment of that U.S.-controlled transit corridor dubbed the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, or TRI-PP.
Quite a name.
Indeed. Imagine the headlines. This created a powerful domestic political imperative for the president. He wants to replicate this high-visibility success. Securing a deal to end the prolonged war in Ukraine would validate his unique diplomatic approach and solidify his peacemaker image, particularly for his base.
That makes a lot of sense, especially considering his track record. He's known for a very unique communication style and a particular way of doing business, isn't he? How does that translate into his diplomatic approach on the global stage?
His approach is certainly defined by a very distinct brand of transactional diplomacy. What does that mean in practice? Well, it prioritizes bilateral deal-making, often, as we've just discussed with India, at the expense of established multilateral frameworks and traditional alliances. The primary tool of influence here is economic statecraft, the strategic deployment of tariffs, and the persistent threat of sanctions, used as direct leverage. We've seen this repeatedly.
Right.
Within his administration, foreign policy execution is largely shaped by a very close circle of advisors, notably Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. This concentration of decision-making power reinforces the personalized, leader-to-leader style of diplomacy that President Trump consistently favors. He seems to believe he can cut deals directly with other heads of state, bypassing the complexities of traditional diplomatic channels, and that personal relationships, or perhaps the threat of economic pain, will ultimately compel action. That's the playbook he's bringing to Alaska.
Okay, so that's Trump's side. Now let's turn to President Putin. Is he genuinely seeking peace in Ukraine, or is there a different calculation motivating him to engage in these talks, particularly at this moment? What's the view from Moscow?
Well, from Moscow's perspective, President Vladimir Putin is approaching the Alaska summit from a clear and arguably well-established position of perceived strength and confidence. By August 2025, with the war now tragically in its fourth year, the Kremlin assesses that time is on its side.
Really? Despite the costs?
Despite the enormous costs, yes. Russian forces are making slow but steady territorial gains on the battlefield. For instance, they captured an additional 226 square miles of Ukrainian land just between July and August 2025 alone. Now, to put that in perspective, that's actually an acceleration from previous months, demonstrating continued, albeit grinding, momentum. They're exerting immense pressure on cities like Pokrovsk and directly threatening the strategically vital town of Chasiv Yar. This military reality underpins Putin's primary motivation, which appears fundamentally tactical.
Tactical in what way?
His main objectives seems to be preempting a new, even more damaging round of U.S. sanctions that President Trump has threatened. Specifically, he's likely worried about secondary sanctions that would target third-party nations like India and China for purchasing Russian oil. That kind of measure could potentially cripple a key economic lifeline for the Kremlin. So for him, this summit looks like a chess move to avoid a major economic hit.
So it sounds like it's more about avoiding sanctions than a genuine shift towards peace. And the format of this summit, excluding Ukraine and European leaders initially, that seems significant in itself, doesn't it?
It's hugely significant, absolutely. The agreement to a bilateral summit with the U.S. president, deliberately excluding Ukrainian and European leaders from the initial meeting, is in itself a major diplomatic victory for Putin. Well, this format effectively elevates Russia to the status of a co-equal great power. It validates its narrative that the war in Ukraine isn't simply a matter of aggression against a sovereign neighbor, but rather a broader geopolitical dispute to be settled directly between Moscow and Washington. It frames the conflict as a great power struggle, not an invasion.
Sidestepping Kyiv.
Completely. The Kremlin, according to sources, completely ignored the initial U.S. proposal for a trilateral meeting that would have included Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. They made it explicitly clear that a meeting with Zelensky would only be considered in the final phase of negotiations, in other words, once the core terms had been agreed upon by the great powers.
And Trump agreed to that.
President Trump subsequently conceded this point, confirming that Zelensky's presence wasn't a prerequisite for his meeting with Putin. This sequence of events is critical. It shows Putin's successful dictation of the engagement's format. It sets the stage for him to potentially present a fait accompli to Kyiv and its European allies, essentially. A done deal they would have little choice but to accept. It's a classic power play.
Right. A very clear signal. Okay, let's move into the second section. Before we dive into the specific diplomatic proposals that might be on the table in Alaska, it's absolutely crucial to ground ourselves in the devastating human toll and the military realities on the ground in Ukraine as of August 2025. What's the situation there? It's been going on so long now.
You're absolutely right. The human cost is just immense, and it really can't be overstated. After more than 3 years of brutal, grinding conflict, the war has tragically settled into a devastating war of attrition. A meat grinder, really. While precise and independently verifiable casualty figures are incredibly difficult to obtain amidst ongoing fighting, a U.S. military estimate from April 2025 placed Russian casualties at more than 790,000 killed or injured.
790,000.
Yes. To put that into perspective, that's almost 4 times the entire population of Iceland. It's staggering. Ukrainian losses are also immense, with President Zelensky himself providing an estimate of 400,000 killed or injured back in January 2025. So that number is likely higher now.
Just devastating numbers on both sides.
Absolutely. This immense bloodshed has created significant manpower shortages for Ukraine, a critical vulnerability that Russian strategy clearly aims to exploit as the war continues. It's a tragic statistic that underscores the immense suffering.
And militarily, how does that translate onto the map? What's the current state of play in terms of territory held?
Militarily, Russia currently occupies approximately 18.9% of Ukrainian territory. Maybe a bit more now. These things change daily. They've managed to make notable gains in recent months, demonstrating that even slow advances can add up significantly over time. It's a slow crawl, but it's forward movement for them.
Where's the main fighting concentrated?
The epicenter of the fighting remains concentrated in the eastern Donetsk region. Russian troops are exerting immense pressure on the city of Pokrovsk. This city is a key logistics hub, and taking it would significantly disrupt Ukrainian supply lines. They're also seriously threatening to encircle Ukrainian units in the strategically vital town of Chasiv Yar.
Why is Chasiv Yar so important?
Capturing Chasiv Yar would open up a direct route to larger, heavily fortified Ukrainian cities like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So it's a critical objective for Russia if they succeed in encircling it. These are just dots on a map. They represent lives, infrastructure, and critical strategic advantage.
Given this incredibly grim reality on the ground, how has public sentiment within Ukraine shifted? Are people still as resolute as they were early in the war, or is the prolonged hardship starting to change perspectives?
Well, amid this grim and exhausting reality, public sentiment within Ukraine has indeed begun to shift. It reflects the immense sacrifices and, frankly, the sheer fatigue of prolonged hardship. Recent polling indicates a notable evolution from the early, almost universally defiant years of the war. A majority of Ukrainians, specifically 56%, would now countenance some form of compromise to end the war.
That's a significant number.
It is, and a significant portion, 51%, explicitly support peace negotiations. Now, this isn't a call for surrender, let's be clear, but it marks a clear psychological and political shift. It creates a domestic environment in which a negotiated settlement, even one with unfavorable terms that might have been unthinkable before, may now be more conceivable for the leadership. It's a testament to the grinding toll of the conflict on the Ukrainian people.
So, turning back to the negotiating table, if we look at Russia's position, what exactly are their demands for a peace deal? Are they showing any flexibility at all, or is this still very much a dictated set of terms from their side?
Throughout the conflict, and critically, in the lead-up to the Alaska summit, Vladimir Putin's conditions for peace have remained remarkably consistent and, quite frankly, maximalist. These demands, first articulated as early as 2022 and then reiterated in a major speech in June 2024, effectively amount to a call for Ukraine's full capitulation.
No change then.
None reported. Putin's foreign affairs advisor Yuri Ushakov confirmed in August 2025 that there haven't been any shifts in the Russian position, reinforcing their unwavering stance. The core insight here, I think, is that Russia's demands aren't really a starting point for negotiation. They're more like a strategic blueprint for dismantling Ukrainian sovereignty, designed to appear like peace while fundamentally achieving their war aims.
Okay, so what are these core demands?
Right. Russia's core demands for a comprehensive peace treaty are quite extensive and uncompromising. First, there's territorial recognition. Russia demands full international legal recognition of its 2014 annexation of Crimea and its 2022 annexation of 4 Ukrainian oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson.
Including areas they don't fully control.
Yes, and critically, this includes a demand that Ukraine withdraw its forces from the parts of these regions it still controls as a precondition for any ceasefire, not as a result of negotiations.
Wow, so give up land before talking peace.
Exactly. It means giving up contested territory before talks even properly begin. Second, neutrality. Ukraine must formally declare a neutral status between Russia and the West, permanently abandoning its constitutional aspiration to join the NATO military alliance. Third, demilitarization. Strict and permanent limitations must be placed on the sides of Ukraine's armed forces, and Kiev must agree to a ban on the stationing of any foreign troops or the delivery of Western armaments to its soil, essentially disarming Ukraine. And finally, denazification and political restructuring. Russia demands political changes within Ukraine, including recognizing Russian as an official language on par with Ukrainian and dissolving nationalist groups. This last point is widely interpreted as a thinly veiled pretext for removing the current government and installing a pro-Russian regime, thereby ensuring Ukraine remains subordinate to Moscow's sphere of influence.
That sounds less like a negotiation and much more like a demand for unconditional surrender. If those are the terms, what does this all mean for any realistic path to peace?
That's precisely the analysis from many quarters, yes. An examination of these terms makes it abundantly clear that Russia is not genuinely seeking a compromise. Instead, it seems they're pursuing a dictated peace that would effectively erase Ukraine's sovereignty and secure Moscow's long-held imperial objectives. As one analyst put it, Russia seeks to reduce everything to discussing the impossible. Meaning, they present terms that are clear non-starters for Ukraine as if they are points for negotiation, when in reality they are demands for capitulation. Their core position hasn't changed. Russia seems to want Kyiv to surrender, not negotiate a shared future. It's a complete non-starter for Ukraine, obviously.
Speaking of Ukraine, President Zelensky and his government have maintained a very firm and defiant posture against ceding any land. That's been consistent. What are their absolute red lines for peace, and how do they respond to these Russian demands?
Kyiv's negotiating position stands in stark and direct opposition to Moscow's on several fundamental points. You're right, they've been very consistent. President Zelensky has repeatedly and unequivocally rejected any peace agreement that involves the concession of Ukrainian territory. He has publicly stated in very strong terms that Ukrainians will not gift their land to the occupier, warning that decisions without Ukraine would be stillborn and unworkable.
A partition attempt, he called it.
Yes, he framed such a deal not as a lasting peace, but as a second attempt to partition Ukraine, echoing historical fears, and warning that it would only serve as a prelude to further Russian aggression down the line, essentially buying time for Russia to rearm and attack again.
So what are Ukraine's core demands then?
Their core demands are equally clear. First and foremost, they insist that a full and unconditional 30-day ceasefire must be the prerequisite for any substantive political negotiations. This directly contradicts Russia's demand for territorial withdrawal as the very first step, complete opposite.
Right.
Secondly, Ukraine's paramount demand is for robust, legally binding, and multilateral security guarantees from Western powers to deter and defend against any future Russian attack.
Yeah.
While NATO membership remains the ultimate constitutional goal, a concrete security architecture, perhaps from key allies, is seen as non-negotiable.
Another point.
Kiev also demands the return of all deported and illegally displaced children, a truly heartbreaking aspect of the war, and a total prisoner exchange. What's crucial to understand here is their position on territory. While they might perhaps accept that parts of the country remain under Russian occupation temporarily and forego immediate military operations to liberate them, they will not, under any circumstances, officially cede territory or redraw the map. They view that as an unforgivable constitutional and moral violation.
Understood. And how are European leaders reacting to these bilateral talks, especially since Ukraine is excluded from the initial meeting between Trump and Putin? There's got to be some significant concern there about being sidelined.
There absolutely is concern. European leaders, folks in France, Germany, the UK, Poland, they've publicly voiced support for the diplomatic track initiated by the summit. They recognize that dialogue is necessary, However, they have also issued joint statements stressing repeatedly that any solution must protect Ukraine's sovereignty and long-term security interests. That's the key phrase. French President Emmanuel Macron explicitly stated, and I quote, "Ukraine's future cannot be decided without the Ukrainians. Europeans will also necessarily be part of the solution, as their own security is at stake."
A very pointed message.
Very. It's a clear signal of European resistance to any deal that might be imposed on Kyiv by Washington and Moscow. In a proactive move, national security advisors from Ukrainian allies gathered in Britain just the Saturday prior to the Putin-Trump summit, precisely to align their views and ensure a united front. Zelensky himself called those talks constructive, emphasizing that the path to peace for Ukraine should be determined together and only together with Ukraine. This is key principle.
So a united front from the allies.
This collective stance underscores a strong desire among European nations not to be sidelined and to ensure Ukraine's agency in its own future. It's a very delicate dance for them, trying to support diplomacy but protect Ukraine.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite worrying from Ukraine's perspective, as you've laid out. President Trump has publicly floated this concept of a peace deal involving some swapping of territories to the betterment of both Russia and Ukraine. What does that actually mean on the ground? And what are the strategic implications of such a proposal if it were to materialize?
Right. And while the president has remained deliberately vague on specifics, likely to maintain negotiating flexibility, this proposal is widely interpreted, both in Kyiv and in Western capitals, as a potential framework for implementing Russia's core territorial demands, particularly the formal cession of the Donbas region and other occupied lands to Moscow. It's presented as a pragmatic middle ground, but the reality on the ground makes it far more complex and, frankly, dangerous for Ukraine.
So it's not just lines on a map.
Not at all. It's essentially asking Ukraine to legitimize Russia's territorial gains through force. A detailed military strategic analysis, like the one from the Institute for the Study of War, reveals that such a swap would be, well, a catastrophic move for Ukraine's long-term security. Putin's demand for Ukraine to withdraw from the remainder of Donetsk Oblast as a precondition for a ceasefire would force Ukrainian forces to abandon their most critical defensive positions.
A fortress built.
Exactly. This isn't just any land. This is a line known as the Fortress Belt. It comprises a series of heavily fortified cities and towns, including Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. These have been systematically reinforced over the past 11 years, precisely to serve as the backbone of Ukraine's defense in the Donbass. These positions have successfully thwarted major Russian advances for years, absorbing significant pressure and preventing deeper penetration into Ukraine.
So giving that up.
Ceding this ground would not be a mere territorial exchange. It would be a fundamental strategic surrender, a military disaster potentially. It would force Ukrainian troops to fall back to hastily prepared defensive lines in open, flat terrain that is far less defensible. Imagine trying to dig in on a wide-open plain compared to fighting from established trenches and fortified urban areas. It's a huge disadvantage. This would grant Russian forces a commanding advantage, positioning them on an ideal launchpad for a future renewed offensive aimed at capturing the rest of southern and eastern Ukraine, including the major industrial hubs of Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. It essentially removes Ukraine's strongest natural and man-made defensive barriers, leaving them exposed.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, a peace deal framed as a pragmatic territory swap is not a genuine compromise from Ukraine's perspective at all. It sounds like something far more insidious.
Exactly. That's the assessment. It is, in military terms, a strategic Trojan horse. It offers Russia the opportunity to achieve its long-term military objectives, which seems to be the creation of a permanently weakened and indefensible Ukraine, without bearing the immense costs in blood and treasure required to seize that territory by force. What President Trump may present as a deal-maker's solution to end a war is, in military terms, a deal that tragically trades Ukraine's long-term survival and security for a short-term cessation of hostilities.
Setting them up for future problems.
Precisely. It would inadvertently set the stage for a future, more decisive Russian assault, putting Ukraine's very existence at far greater risk down the line. That's a critical distinction for anyone trying to understand the implications of this summit.
Absolutely critical. Okay, let's shift gears now into the third major component here. It's clear that the Ukraine conflict is far from isolated. But what's fascinating and quite alarming is how deeply intertwined it's become with this escalating trade dispute with India. Let's pivot now to this other major crisis unfolding. How exactly did that relationship, the U.S.-India one, get so fraught so quickly? And what are these tariffs really about?
Right, running parallel to the high-stakes diplomacy over Ukraine is indeed this severe and escalating trade dispute. And it has blindsided many observers, you're right, given the previously strengthening U.S.-India strategic partnership. It really reached a boiling point on August 6, 2025, when President Trump signed that executive order 18329. It was specifically titled, Addressing Threats to the United States by the Government of the Russian Federation. Very direct.
And that authorized the tariff.
Yes, it authorized an additional 25% ad valorem duty. That's essentially a tax based on the value of the goods on a wide range of products imported from India. And as we mentioned, this wasn't a standalone measure. It came on top of an existing 25% tariff, bringing the cumulative rate to that truly punitive 50% for most Indian products. These new crippling duties are set to take full effect on August 27th, so the clock is ticking.
What's the official justification? Why link India to threats from Russia?
Well, the administration's official justification is national security. The White House argues that India's continued large-scale purchases of Russian crude oil provide a direct financial lifeline to the Kremlin, thereby, in their view, funding Russia's war effort in Ukraine and consequently undermining U.S. foreign policy objectives to weaken Russia economically. They claim these imports, whether direct or via intermediaries, present an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, justifying these emergency economic measures. It's a very direct linkage they're drawing.
But is that the whole story? Or are there other, perhaps unstated objectives behind these tariffs? Because it feels like there's more going on beneath the surface, connecting back to the summit, maybe.
You're perceptive to pick up on that. Analysts and Indian officials widely view this national security rationale as, well, in their words, a pretext for broader goals. The tariffs are largely seen as a form of economic blackmail, designed to achieve potentially two other primary objectives.
Okay, what are they?
First, and this has been a long-standing issue, to force India's hand in long-stalled bilateral trade negotiations. Specifically, the U.S. has been pushing for greater access for U.S. firms to India's protected agricultural and dairy markets. These are politically very sensitive sectors in India.
Ah, the old trade sticking points.
Exactly. And second, crucially, to use India as a high-profile example, to coerce other nations to curtail their economic ties with Russia, thereby creating new leverage over Putin ahead of the Alaska summit. The message to other countries, perhaps like China, is, if we can do this to India, a partner, we can do it to you.
Using India as leverage against Putin.
It certainly looks that way. It's a tactical move to pressure Russia indirectly through its partners, demonstrating a willingness to inflict economic pain, even on allies.
What's the likely economic impact on India? 50% tariffs sound huge.
They are. The economic impact on India is projected to be significant. These tariffs place at risk a substantial portion of India's $87 billion in annual exports to the United States, and the U.S. is India's largest trading partner, so this matters a lot.
Huge exposure.
Yes. Economists estimate the measures could shave between 0.2% and 0.5% off India's GDP growth. Now, for an economy that needs robust growth to lift millions out of poverty, that's a non-trivial hit, a real blow. Sectors such as textiles, leather goods, gems and jewelry, and engineering products are particularly vulnerable to these increased duties, potentially leading to job losses and reduced profits.
Are there any exceptions?
Interestingly, yes. The administration has carved out exemptions for certain critical goods, including pharmaceuticals, where India supplies a large portion of the U.S. market, and semiconductors. This is seen by some as a tacit acknowledgement of U.S. dependence on these crucial supply chains. It shows where their leverage has limits and where cutting off supplies would hurt the U.S. economy too much.
So how has New Delhi reacted to these tariffs and this immense economic pressure? Are they backing down, showing signs of compromise, or are they digging in for a fight?
Quite the opposite of backing down, actually. India's reaction to the tariffs has been one of sharp condemnation and strategic defiance. Very strong words. The Indian government has publicly labeled the U.S. action as unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. They've accused Washington of hypocrisy, pointing out that many U.S. allies, and indeed the U.S. itself, continue to trade with Russia in various commodities, particularly energy, when it serves their interests.
A do as I say, not as I do argument.
Precisely. From their perspective, yes. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, facing significant domestic political pressure to protect Indian industries, has drawn very firm red lines around the issues of agriculture and dairy. He explicitly stated, and I think this is a crucial quote, "For us, the interest of our farmers is our top priority. India will never compromise on the interests of farmers, fishermen, and dairy farmers." Then he added, "I know we will have to pay a heavy price for it, and I'm ready for it. India is ready for it."
That's very strong language, not backing down at all.
Not at all. This makes it highly unlikely that India will cave to U.S. demands in these sensitive areas, signaling a very firm stance indeed.
So what are they doing in response? Practical.
In response to this economic pressure, India is actively pursuing a three-pronged mitigation strategy. This includes developing new export promotion schemes to support affected industries, working aggressively to divert trade to other international markets, essentially finding new buyers for their goods, and identifying sectors where domestic production can be ramped up to fulfill demand that was previously met by imports. It's a massive economic reorientation they're attempting.
And impacting other areas of the relationship too, like defense.
Yes, that's a key point. And a clear sign of the deteriorating relationship, India has also reportedly paused plans to purchase U.S. military hardware. This includes discussions on Stryker combat vehicles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, and Boeing P-8I reconnaissance aircraft. Major potential deals. Now, Indian officials have officially described reports of a pause as false and fabricated and insist that procurement is progressing. But Reuters, a very reliable source, specifically cites Indian officials confirming a pause in forward movement on these deals. This illustrates a direct, material impact on the strategic defense partnership, moving well beyond just trade friction.
So what's fascinating here is that India is not just passively accepting this, they're pushing back hard. And seemingly they're looking to strengthen other alliances as a direct response to this perceived coercion from the U.S. What kind of shifts are we seeing there?
You've hit on a crucial point. India is not a passive pawn in this great power game. It is a major power in its own right. It has a fierce tradition of strategic autonomy and non-alignment, despite its closer ties with the U.S. in recent years. They value their independence. By reacting defiantly and actively exploring closer ties elsewhere, New Delhi is signaling that it will not be coerced into abandoning its own national interests, especially when it feels its sovereignty or economic well-being is under direct threat.
Like the Modi-Putin call.
Exactly. In a truly significant development, Prime Minister Modi spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin on August 8th, the very day the tariffs were announced. Very symbolic timing. They discussed Ukraine, yes, but they also explicitly reaffirmed their special and privileged strategic partnership. That exact phrasing matters. Modi even stated he looked forward to hosting Putin in India later this year for the 23rd India-Russia Annual Summit, a clear message of continuity in their relationship despite U.S. pressure.
And China's reaction.
Also significant, President Xi Jinping of China and Putin also spoke on the same day, August 8th. And China publicly welcomed Modi's planned visit to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO summit, in Tianjin later this month. This shows a clear movement towards alternative strategic alignments and a strengthening of non-Western blocs, seemingly in response to perceived U.S. pressure.
So what does this all mean for the U.S.'s broader strategic interests, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region? Given how important the U.S.-India partnership is supposed to be as a counterbalance to China, it sounds like there could be some severe unintended consequences for the United States here.
You've hit on a profoundly critical point. The most significant consequence of this trade dispute is the severe rupture it is causing in the U.S.-India strategic partnership. A major break. This partnership has been meticulously cultivated by successive U.S. administrations over 2 decades, transcending political parties. It was seen as a huge success story. It's widely considered the cornerstone of American strategy to build a regional coalition, especially through alliances like the Quad, to counterbalance the rising power and influence of China in the Indo-Pacific.
And this crisis threatens that.
It threatens to unravel much of this painstakingly built progress, potentially setting back U.S. foreign policy objectives by years, if not decades.
What about the Quad specifically? Australia, Japan, India, U.S.?
The cohesion, and indeed the very viability of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, is now very much in question. An upcoming Quad Leaders Summit, which was scheduled to be hosted by India, is shrouded in uncertainty. There are credible reports that New Delhi is potentially looking to delay or even downscale the event to avoid a high-profile confrontation with President Trump. That would be a significant blow to the grouping's image and effectiveness, showing disunity.
And the alternative alignments.
More alarmingly, in response to what it perceives as American coercion, India is signaling a potential strategic reevaluation. Reports indicate that talks are underway to revive the Russia-India-China, or RIC, trilateral framework. This diplomatic alignment would directly contravene the Quad's primary objective of containing Chinese influence. It represents a considerable and worrying shift in regional dynamics, almost a pivot away from the U.S. focus.
It really does sound like a two-front strategy, as you put it.
Yes, this entire situation reveals a high-risk, two-front, coercive strategy being employed by the Trump administration. Unable, perhaps, to force Putin's hand directly on Ukraine, the administration has opened this second economic front against India. And the irony here is stark. India is simultaneously one of Russia's key economic partners, and crucially, one of America's most critical strategic partners. The underlying logic appears to be that by demonstrating a willingness to inflict economic pain on one of Putin's lifelines, the U.S. can create new leverage over Moscow. But it's a very blunt instrument being used.
So to distill all this, what does this mean for the bigger picture? It really does sound like a potentially self-defeating policy for the United States, given their broader strategic goals, especially regarding China.
It absolutely creates a profound strategic paradox for the United States, a real contradiction. In an attempt to solve a short-term security problem in Europe, the ongoing war in Ukraine, the administration is inadvertently alienating its most important long-term partner in the strategic competition with China. The policy risks unraveling the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy far more quickly and certainly than it pressures Moscow to concede in Ukraine. It prioritizes what appears to be a transactional diplomatic gambit over generational strategic alliance. And that could have lasting negative consequences for America's overall standing and influence on the global stage. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by setting fire to your own house. The short-term fix might seem appealing, but the long-term damage could be immense.
A very stark analogy. Okay, let's move into our final section. We've got these incredibly complex, conflicting ambitions, the stark military realities on the ground, immense geopolitical pressures all converging on Alaska. Given all this, what are the most likely ways this Alaska summit could actually play out? What are the potential scenarios?
Right, the Alaska summit is poised at a truly precarious intersection. It's really balanced on a knife edge. The outcome will fundamentally be determined by the degree to which President Trump's strong desire for a deal can somehow bridge the vast chasm between Russia's maximalist demands and Ukraine's existential red lines, which seems difficult. Three primary scenarios seem to emerge from this incredibly complex dynamic, each with very different global implications.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and I'd say by far the least probable, is a grand bargain framework. In this scenario, Presidents Trump and Putin emerge, perhaps surprisingly, to announce a major breakthrough. This would likely involve an immediate ceasefire tied to significant Ukrainian concessions, things like the de facto or de jure cession of territories like Donbas, and a formal commitment to neutrality precluding NATO membership, basically meeting Russia's core demands.
And in return?
In return, Russia would secure its territorial gains, and the U.S. would agree not to implement new sanctions, perhaps even rolling back the punitive tariffs on India as a gesture. The implications of this would be immense. While it would be framed as a major political victory for Trump, fulfilling his peacemaker role, it would be a strategic triumph for Putin, effectively legitimizing aggression and rewarding conquest in a way unseen in Europe since World War II.
The reaction would be strong.
Fierce resistance from Ukraine, certainly, and likely from many European allies, too, leading to a deep fracture in the transatlantic alliance. This kind of peace would be inherently unstable, built on Ukrainian resentment, and seen by many as appeasement that emboldens future Russian revanchism and aggression across the continent. And it's a very dangerous path, even if it's unlikely.
Okay, so that's the low probability grand bargain. What's the second scenario? More plausible.
A more plausible outcome, arguably, and the second scenario we're looking at is a limited ceasefire or frozen conflict. Here, the leaders fail to agree on the core political issues like territory. The gaps are just too wide, the demands too maximalist, the red lines too firm. However, they might manage to secure a limited tactical agreement for an immediate and enduring ceasefire. This would effectively freeze the current lines of contact without resolving the final status of occupied territories. Just stop the shooting for now.
What does that look like?
Well, from a humanitarian perspective, this is arguably the least bad short-term outcome, as it halts the daily bloodshed and saves lives immediately. Both leaders could claim partial victory, Trump for ending the active fighting, Putin for consolidating his gains without further immediate cost. However, it creates a highly volatile and unstable frozen conflict. None of the underlying drivers of the war would be resolved. Nothing fundamental changes.
Leaving Ukraine in a tough spot.
Extremely tough. Ukraine would be left in permanent military mobilization, its economy crippled by the ongoing uncertainty and the need to maintain a massive defense posture indefinitely. Russia, meanwhile, would solidify its occupation and gain valuable time to rearm and reconstitute forces, preparing for a potential renewal of hostilities from a more advantageous military position at a time of its choosing. Think of conflicts like Transnistria or Abkhazia. They linger for decades, simmering with potential for renewed violence. It doesn't solve the problem, it just pauses it.
Right. Okay, so that's the frozen conflict. What's the third and perhaps most likely scenario?
Finally, the third and arguably most probable scenario, given the unbridgeable gap we've discussed between the negotiating positions, is a diplomatic stalemate and escalation. In this outcome, the summit essentially collapses or produces no meaningful agreement after it becomes clear that Russia's maximalist demands are non-negotiable, and Ukraine, backed by Europe, will never accept them. Putin, perhaps having successfully used the talks as a delaying tactic to forestall sanctions and consolidate battlefield gains, would refuse meaningful concessions. This would leave Trump empty-handed and without his sought-after deal.
And the implications of that failure.
Severe. President Trump, potentially feeling humiliated or politically weakened by Putin's refusal, would be under immense political pressure domestically to demonstrate resolve and follow through on his prior threats. This would almost certainly trigger a sharp escalation. The U.S. would likely implement the full suite of threatened sanctions against Russia. And crucially, those secondary sanctions against its key trading partners like India and China would likely kick in, deepening the U.S.-India trade war and further damaging that strategic relationship.
And on the ground in Ukraine?
On the battlefield, the failure of the diplomatic track would likely lead to a significant intensification of fighting. Both sides might seek to gain leverage through renewed military means, potentially leading to even greater bloodshed and a more entrenched conflict. Stalemate often leads to trying to break it militarily.
That paints a pretty stark picture across all scenarios, really. So, regardless of the direct outcome of the Alaska summit itself, what are the broader long-term ripples we should be watching for across the global stage? How might this moment redefine global power dynamics for years or even decades to come?
That's the key question. This Alaska summit, whatever its specific outcome, undoubtedly marks a critical inflection point with profound strategic implications that will reverberate across the global stage for a long time. First, let's look at European security. A peace settlement brokered on Putin's terms would shatter the foundational principles of the post-Cold War European security order. It would effectively validate the use of military aggression to alter sovereign borders.
A dangerous precedent.
Hugely dangerous, setting a precedent for other authoritarian regimes globally. Even a frozen conflict scenario would require European nations to commit to a long-term, costly, and resource-intensive military containment of revanchist Russia. This burden they would likely have to shoulder with increasing autonomy from the U.S. It underscores a critical reality for European leaders. They must accelerate efforts to build genuine strategic autonomy and prepare for a future in which U.S. security guarantees may become more conditional and its leadership more transactional and perhaps less reliable, putting a strain on long-standing alliances like NATO.
Okay, that's Europe. What about the Indo-Pacific?
Second, for the Indo-Pacific, the collateral damage inflicted upon the U.S.-India relationship by the administration's coercive tariff strategy presents a major strategic opportunity for China. It's undeniable. A fractured Quad, a distracted United States, and an India that feels alienated from its Western partners could create a power vacuum that Beijing would be eager to exploit, potentially expanding its influence across the region relatively unchallenged. A potential Indian pivot toward that revived Russia-India-China RIC trilateral framework we discussed would represent a generational setback for U.S. strategy in Asia. It actively works against the very objective of containing Chinese influence, a very real risk.
Turning a tactical move into a strategic loss.
Potentially, yes. Third, for U.S. grand strategy itself, this entire episode highlights a fundamental and as yet unresolved tension within the Trump administration's foreign policy approach. There's the deep contradiction between the pursuit of short-term, high-visibility deals and the patient, long-term cultivation of the alliances and international norms that have historically underpinned U.S. global leadership since World War II.
Tactics versus strategy.
Precisely. The willingness to jeopardize a cornerstone strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific one, that took decades to build to gain perceived leverage in a European conflict demonstrates a tactical rather than genuinely strategic approach to global affairs. This risks undermining America's overall standing and influence in a way that could take decades to repair, potentially signaling to other allies that their partnerships are conditional and transactional.
And finally, the global economy.
And finally, on a broader note, the global economic impact is already significant and could certainly worsen depending on the outcome. As the KPMG source highlights, the conflict and sanctions have already caused commodity chaos, particularly in energy markets where prices remain high. And critical food supplies have been heavily impacted, contributing to global inflation pressures. This has already led to forecasts of a 10% contraction of the Russian economy, which is huge, and perhaps a 1% reduction of overall global growth. That's billions of dollars in lost economic activity, impacting jobs and livelihoods worldwide.
And cyber threats.
Yes. Beyond that, there's a heightened global cybersecurity threat. KPMG specifically flags this, requiring all organizations to be on a significantly increased alert. We're seeing more tit-for-tat cyber attacks becoming a common feature of these geopolitical tensions, affecting everything from critical infrastructure to financial systems. These aren't just distant headlines. They are direct impacts on global stability, prosperity, and indeed our daily lives.
That was a truly deep dive into some incredibly complex and interconnected global challenges. It really shows how every action on the global stage, whether it's a high-stakes summit or a seemingly targeted tariff, has these far-reaching, often unpredictable effects that ripple across continents. What stood out to you most as we unpacked all this material today?
What stands out to me most is the stark reality that international relations are rarely simple, are they? And intentions, even well-meaning ones, perhaps from a leader's perspective, can have profound unintended consequences. We see that clearly here. The attempt to solve one problem can inadvertently create or exacerbate another, especially when traditional alliances are strained by more transactional diplomacy. The unwavering stance of Ukraine, the strategic defiance of India, and the maximalist demands of Russia. It all reveals a landscape where true compromise is elusive, and every move has a significant ripple effect. It's a reminder of the inherent volatility in the international system right now. And this raises an important question, I think, for you, our listener, to consider. If national leaders, despite their stated desires for peace or perhaps for economic advantage, can find themselves entangled in such complex and potentially self-defeating loops, what does this tell you about the inherent unpredictability of the global stage? How might the outcomes of seemingly isolated events, like a summit in Alaska or a tariff dispute in Washington, quietly shape alliances and redefine global power dynamics for decades to come, long after the immediate headlines have faded? Something for you to perhaps mull over or explore on your own.